There are a total of 7 data types in PHP, and all of these, save one, are ways for us to hold data. Here are those data types. Integers, which hold whole numbers. Floats, which hold fractional numbers, such as 4.2. Strings, which are used to hold a string of characters, such as letters and sentences. Arrays, they're a very useful data type and will allow us to store multiple data types in an organized fashion. Booleans, which are used for defining objects true or false. And objects, which are very complex variables and extremely powerful. They are the base of object-oriented PHP. Our outlier, resources, can be defined as anything that is not PHP data, such as files or responses from database queries. Let's learn more about several of these core data types, starting with integers and floats. So far, we've learned about how to assign and recall from variables, mostly using string content or character content. Let's talk about the data type of integers. Now, integers are whole numbers, such as 1 through 9 or -1 through -9, whatever. Any of these are considered integers. Now, we can create integer-based variables. So let's scroll down and do a little bit of work with integers now. So we'll scroll down to our work area here in the bottom where we had our array for white space and our pre-tag. We're going to take all of this out from in here and delete that. Now, what I want to do is create a couple of integer variables. Now, the names, again, don't really matter, but we want to keep it readable. So I'm going to actually name the first one 1, and I'm going to set it equal to an integer 1. Now, 1 and then a semicolon. If you notice, I'm not putting double quotes around it. If I were to put double quotes around it, it would actually be considered a string, not an integer. So I'll show you the difference here in a minute, but let's create a few more. So here's 2. We'll set that equal to 2. And then let's do another one, 3. Set it equal to 3. Okay. So here you see we have 1, 2, and 3. Now let's echo these. So we'll say echo, and then 1, and then close that out. Let's see what that looks like in our preview. Okay, so it looks like a 1 as we expect. It's printing it in HTML. It's just a 1. So what about if I was to say echo, and then not the variable 1, but just the string 1? Let's tab back over and refresh our page. Looks exactly the same. So how do we know that something is an integer or something is a string? Well, there are built-in functions inside of PHP that we can use to look at variables, inspect them, modify them. We're going to get into internal functions later, not in this course, but in part 2. But for now, we're going to touch on a few of these internal functions that are very helpful to us. The first one that we're going to talk about is called getType. So if I create a new variable here, I'll call it string _1. And I'm going to set it equal to the string version of 1. Now I'm going to go outside of here, and I'm going to create a couple of list items here. So li. All right, do one more. You put these inside of a unordered list. Clean it up a little. Okay. So now I want to echo just this particular one. So PHP and then echo 1. All right, and then on the next line, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to echo string 1, so we can look at them side by side. Switch back over and refresh. So both of these, string 1 and integer 1, are identical. So how do we know the difference? We'll look at that internal function called getType. So we'll go down here, and we will use the PHP function getType by typing getType, all one word, and then open a parentheses, and then close our variable with the parentheses. So we're echoing the output of this function, a built-in function to PHP called getType. I'll put a link to the documents for getType in the notes. So I'm going to save this. switch back over. I'm going to refresh. So you notice here the type is integer. So let's switch over, go back, and do the same thing on the second one. So get type, open that up, and close it. Save it, switch over, and we'll go up to refresh again. So you see integer and string. So you can tell here that they're two different types. It's not such a big concern for us just now, but it's good to know that we can test and find out whether something is actually an integer or a string. Let's switch back over to our code, get rid of this, and let's do a little bit of math with our integers. Okay, so here what I want to do is I just want to echo 1. But I'm going to use an operator that you've seen all the time, plus, and then I'm going to say 2. Hit save, switch back over, and refresh. 3. Awesome. So by using the plus operator or the sum operator, we're able to add two numbers together. The numbers are integers and they're in variables. So this is awesome for us. So this is a very powerful way for us to use operators such as plus or minus with integer variables. So let's go and do a little bit more here and say minus, and then we will say our variable 3. Save that, switch over, and it brings us to 0. So that should give you a good understanding of what an integer is. Next up, let's talk a little bit about floats. So floats, or floating point integers, or real numbers, or doubles, whatever you want to call them, we call them floats inside of PHP, or floating point numbers. So we need that when we're doing things that have a decimal place. Let's go ahead and do a quick example of how we can use floating points in an almost real-world example. Let's say we want to find out a distance of a trip. So we'll say we have two variables here, distance to home, all right? And we'll set that equal to a floating point number. The way we do that is simply say 1 point and then whatever, 2. So 1.2. Close it with a semicolon for our statement. Then we'll add another variable that's a floating point. So distance to work. Same thing, maybe we'll do 2.5. Now we can use the same type of operations we have done before. We'll actually do that down below. We'll do it here. We'll create another list item. And then inside of this one, we'll do a bit of math here. So let's say we want to echo the distance to work plus our distance to home. All right, we'll save that, switch back over and refresh. And you see we can take floating point numbers and sum them together and get returned a floating point. Now, how do we know that we get a floating point? Well, we could use our getType. It'll actually return the keyword double, but it means the same thing, floating point number. Now, what if we were to add a non-floating point number to this equation? So let's say we'll add the integer variable 3, which is a whole number. Save that, switch over and refresh. 6.7. So if we take whole numbers and we sum them to floating point numbers, we're still going to get a floating point in return. So that gives you a good understanding of what a floating point number is, how we can use them, and how we can do operations with them and standard integer variables.